All right, so what we're going to do now is just a quick review of rendering setup for Mental-Ray with trees. This is stuff that's been talked about a bit in the other previous DVDs in the series, but it's just kind of a good review to do. So with Onyx trees, once they're imported, as I've been mentioning, just group them together. And for all the geometry in the scene, of course, you want to make sure that your visible and reflections and refractions has been turned on. So I've already done that. And so the next thing is, I would probably go and take the time to name all of these just so that I know what they are, etc. But I'm not going to do all that right now in front of you. So I don't have any lights or anything in the scene, no shaders. When you import stuff from Onyx, it will come in with a shader, but it's not a shader you want to use. So right now, if I open Hypershade, all that we have in here is just a Lambert shader, just a default. So basically, it's an empty scene from a rendering perspective. So obviously, the first thing I want to do is make sure that I'm set to using Mental-Ray. And then these are the first things that I do every time that I'm going to do anything that has outdoor lighting. So switch to Mental-Ray, decide the resolution I want to render at. So I'm just choosing 720p. And then under quality, I'm going to set my adaptive sampling just for test renders, let's say to 1. And then by default, this is set to box. I set it to Gauss, and Gauss defaults to 3 and 3, actually. And so setting it to 2 and 2 will just render a little bit sharper. For animations, I tend to use that. For stills, just for it to be sharper, I use Mitchell 4 and 4, and that gives you the sharpest rendering that you can get so that everything is really, really in focus. But for this, Gauss 2 and 2 will render just a little bit faster than Mitchell. And then under the ray tracing settings, this defaults to something like this. So I just set my refractions to 10 and max trace depth to 20. Just because since we're going to be using MIA materials and that translucency is done via refraction, you want to just set that up. You can increase your reflections as well, but that slows down rendering time a bit, and you usually can't really notice that much of a difference between 1 and higher. So how many times can a reflection bounce between materials? So I usually leave that at 1. I'll do a test render at some point, maybe at 2 or 3 to see if it looks nicer, but usually the difference is really subtle. So from a render time perspective, I often leave that at 1. Then under indirect lighting, we want to create a physical sun and sky. And so I'm going to hit the create button, and then just a window pops up with the attribute editor for the physical sky, which I can ignore. And when you do that, it automatically turns on final gather. And my final gather settings that I use for test renders are 50.130 with 1 secondary bounce. This actually defaults to 0, so I'll put that to 1. Under quality, filter, I set that to 1. If you do high-res renders, you get speckles sometimes, and that fixes it. And then final gather tracing, I set that to 2, 2, and 4, which helps with your secondary bounce. None of these have a big effect on render time. So of all of the final gather settings, the one that really affects render time is your point density. So for test renders, 0.1 is fine, and it'll render way faster. The default is a value of 1, which is really high. It's a strange default. So for final renders, sometimes I'll put that as high as 0.5, but I rarely go higher than that. And so this really is your render time killer. So this is basically test render resolution for me. And final render resolution, often I'll do something like that. But it kind of depends on the scene. But for now, for test rendering, I'll set it that way. So now I have a physical sun and sky in the scene. But when you do that, if you select your camera and go to Hypergraph Connections, what you'll see in here is that it created a MIA exposure simple node and a physical sky node and a sun. And these are all connected to our camera. So that's all well and good, but I don't really like using MIA exposure simple. I prefer MIA exposure photographic. So what I do is I just open Hypershade, go to Mental-Ray Lenses, create an MIA exposure photographic. That will then pop into the hypergraph. And then I basically want to replace the exposure simple with the exposure photographic. So the connections I see here coming out of exposure simple, I just want to do the same thing with exposure photographic. So if I just delete those connections and then grab my photographic one, I can middle mouse button drag it onto the camera and choose default, and middle mouse button drag it onto the physical sky. And for this I have to choose other. And then in the connection editor, make sure that show hidden is on for both left and right display. And then choose the message from the exposure photographic into the MI sky exposure on your physical sky. And that's it. Now we've switched to MIA exposure photographic, and I can delete the simple one. So then in here, what you need to do to get it to render correctly is take your physical sky node, and in the attribute editor, change the RGB unit conversion to 0.318. And so if you don't do that and you do a render, your render is going to be black. So just go and do that, and that's the value needed to have the value range for the exposure node work in conjunction with the physical sky. And that's it. So, but one last thing I like to do is on my exposure node, this is the exposure photographic node, your film ISO and camera shutter and f-stop, if you know about real cameras, control your exposure. And so the main one that I use is f-stop. So on a real camera, the larger the f-stop, the smaller the aperture is on your camera, meaning the opening that lets light in. So if that if the aperture is smaller and less light gets in, you're going to get a darker render. So basically that means that with a value of 16, which is very large for f-stop, the aperture is very small, and so your image is probably going to be underexposed. So for regular midday lighting with the exposure photographic node, I will usually start with a value of 9. And so as my sun gets closer to the horizon, the image is going to start to get a little dark, and I might need to change the f-stop to something like 6 or 5. But 9 is usually my start point for f-stop. And then finally, most of the time when I did renders prior to using these exposure nodes, I often would take my renders into Photoshop or After Effects and adjust levels on them to boost the blacks and brighten the highlights a little bit, just to increase the contrast and make the image look a little bit more properly exposed. And you can do that with the exposure photographic node. So every time I create this node, I pretty much always put crush blacks all the way up practically and burn highlights just a little bit lower than that. So I look at these as adjusting levels in post. And so it just gives you a render that looks a little bit more real, a little bit more exposed. So if you just think about levels in Photoshop, crushing the blacks is like taking the black point and lifting it up. Burn highlights is like taking the white point and bringing it down. So it's brightening the highlights and darkening the shadows. So right now that's basically my sort of final gather physical sky setup. And by creating the physical sky, it created a sun. So that's right there. And since it's a directional light, the position of it in world space does not matter, and so the rotation does. So, but it can be anywhere and you'll get the exact same lighting, so that's just good to know. So that's the MIA physical sun, physical sky part, which is now set up. So everything I just showed you, whenever I have a new scene and I want to add physical sun and sky, I do all those things. So again, I just, I set quality to 1 for test renderers, and I change my multi-pixel filtering. I change my ray trace settings. I change my final gather settings, and create the physical sun and sky. And that's pretty much it. So, but before I actually do a render, I now need some shaders. So the only shader that I use is the MIA Material X, so this guy. And so I can go and select everything for now, all of the trees, and I'm going to assign that. And with this material, I'm actually going to start by creating 3 of them. So I'm going to create that one, and this one. And so I'm creating 3 so that I have one for the ground, one for the tree bark, and one for the leaves. So let's just go and name that ground MIA, and then bark MIA, and then leaves MIA. Now, of course, I'd end up having a bunch of different bark shaders. and a bunch of different leaf shaders. But for now, we're just going to just have a single one. And so I'm going to select my ground plane that I have in the scene and assign that. And then for all of my trees inside here, if I open all of them up, then I basically want to grab in here, and there's obviously a bunch of other ways I could select it, but I'm just control click, shift click, control click, shift click. And I'm selecting all of the tree trunks. Granted, I could have just selected everything, but whatever. So now I have all of that selected. I will assign my bark. And then for my leaves, I'm going to select all of those. And I will assign that leaf material to it. And assign. So now obviously, since I've been doing this stuff for a while, I already have a bunch of different bark shaders and leaf shaders that I like to use. But building them from scratch is something I do a lot too, and it's really, really a very, very simple thing to go and do. So I'm just closing all these nodes up. All right, so what changes am I going to make? Now for the ground, I don't particularly care about having any textures or anything for right now. So I'm going to select the ground. And in the MIA material, there's obviously a bunch of stuff, but the first thing I want to do is set the color of the ground. I want to make the ground just a dark color. But since we're using exposure nodes and the physical sun and sky, it's important to remember that you have to gamma correct all of your textures, anything that has to do with color. So if I'm going to map the color in here, I want to texture it. I don't want to use just a solid color, because if I leave this as just this mid-value gray, it's actually going to render as a much brighter value than a mid-value gray. So if I actually want a mid-value gray ground, I would have to go to Utilities and go to the gamma correct node and set the gamma to 0.454. So you're going to need to do that on anything that's piping into color. And then if I wanted to put a file texture, I could map it here to value, and if I want a solid color, I can just pick a solid color. So by using the gamma correct node, you're going to see that it's going to look a little bit darker in hypershade, but it will render correctly. And so my ground, I'm actually going to just make it a little bit dark for now. So what other changes do I want on the ground? Well, if I go into reflection, I don't want my ground to be a mirror. And that's, if I put the reflectivity to 1 right now, this is basically going to be a mirror, because the glossiness is at 1, which means it has a reflection that's in focus. I want to blur the reflection down. So if I put it down to 0.2, you can see the highlight changes. I'm now just getting a much blurrier reflection on the shader. So I just want a blurry reflection on the ground. So now the reflectivity is really high, but remember that reflectivity is related to BRDF. So it's like a Fresnel effect. So if I look in here, I have 0 and 90-degree reflection. So where it's facing the camera, I'm going to put the reflection really low, and as it turns away from the camera, I'll put the reflection to like 0.5. So even though the reflectivity is at 1, it's related to these reflectivity values. So for just a general purpose ground plane, this is giving me something with blurry reflections that are not too bright. And that's pretty much fine for the ground for now, except maybe I'll turn on ambient occlusion, just so where the tree trunks are touching the ground, we get some extra shading. So that's just my basic ground shader. And then we go to the bark. For a basic bark shader, again, I'm going to want to map color, but I'll probably want to use a texture for that. So again, I would go to color, and then under utilities, grab a gamma correct node and put that to 0.454. But then this time I'll put a texture map inside there. So I'm going to grab a file texture, and whenever I map a file texture, by default Maya blurs your texture quite a bit. You'll see the filter is at 1. I'm going to lower that to 0.1. Whenever I know that my textures are the correct resolution, a filter of 0.1 will give you textures that are nice and sharp and have all of their detail. It's just not going to have that extra blur that Maya does. I could set it to 0, which I know some people do, but then that creates other issues in regards to anti-aliasing and sizzling textures and stuff. So I like to leave it at 0.1. So now I would go and find a texture. So for tree bark, if I just go under maps, I have a directory that just has a bunch of different tree barks. And these come from different, sites like Google searches and CG textures and texture libraries and whatever. So just a bunch of useful tree bark textures. And all of these are tileable, which is obviously something very important for tree bark. So we can just go for now and just grab a generic tree bark texture that we can put on all of our trees. And so obviously you'll end up choosing different types of tree bark textures for different types of trees. But for now we're kind of fine just saying, all right, well, let's just grab some generic tree bark for now. So let's say I grab that one. So this is now my tree bark as far as a texture goes. But if I go into the shader, what else might I want to change? Well, I like to increase the roughness for my bark shaders, and so usually around 0.1 or 0.2. And so that's just going to, soften the diffuse shading a little bit. Then under reflection, I'll put the reflectivity all the way up to 1 and the glossiness down to 0.2. And hopefully you can't hear that noise outside, but maybe you can. But I've got a gardener with a wind blower out there, which is awesome. So lowering the glossiness, again, is the reflection blur. And so obviously something like bark is extremely rough, so it creates a very blurry reflection. So it still is reflective, though. Remember, the whole point of the way we're approaching rendering is more true to life than just using shaders where specularity is a cheat or a fake. In reality, specularity is a reflection. And so the MIA material makes that assumption, and so you're always using reflectivity on all types of materials. It's just a matter of how blurry the reflections are and how bright they are. And so for tree bark, it's a very, very blurry reflection, which is then related to our BRDF, which for tree bark I will start kind of similar to the ground, meaning that the reflectivity is very, very low where it's facing the camera, and it's a little bit higher as it turns away from the camera. So these are all just start points. And then I also would turn on my ambient occlusion, which just helps with shading. Especially since Final Gather can brighten things up a bit, this just helps adding some detail into the shading in conjunction with Final Gather. So that's pretty much my basic tree bark settings, although I would definitely, for tree bark, want to have a spec map and a bump map. And so out of simplicity, what I like to do is utilize the same diffuse map that I'm using for color as a bump and spec. And I can create that in Photoshop, but to make my life a lot easier, what I like to do is actually do it in Maya because it offers a lot of flexibility that way. And what I mean is on my file texture for my tree bark, under Effects, we have something called Color Remap. And if I click that, what Maya does is it takes the output of your file texture, puts it through a remap node and into a ramp. So you can see it just kind of went in the middle here. Well, on this ramp, if I make the red black, get rid of the green one and make the blue one white, we've now created a grayscale version of our texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the output from this to my gamma node and reconnect my file texture node to the value. So I'm still using this as color, but now I have this grayscale version of the texture where I can go and play with the contrast on it. So I can change the interpolation. So if you look at the swatch preview here, you can see that as I do this, I'm basically kind of like adjusting levels in Photoshop. So for creating bump maps and spec maps, it's really, really awesome to be able to just do it straight in Maya. So I'm going to go in here and use the same one for both bump and spec. And so I'm going to do something like this. So we're adjusting the contrast on this. So the darkest area from a specular value or reflection value is going to be not black, which would mean no reflections, but just a little bit, kind of dark. This is going to be white. And then I can obviously use the same one as a bump. I could do the color remap thing twice and have a different one for bump and a different one for spec, of course, as well. And then once I have this, I will take this map and I will pipe it into my bark shader, going to the reflection color, and also going to standard bump. And so now I've got this. So let's move that one out of the way. And so here is my basic shading network, as you can see, for my tree bark. And then on my bump node, the bump depth of 1 is going to be way too deep for my tree bark. So I'm going to start with something really much smaller, like 0.05. And so that's probably for this scene going to be pretty close to what we would want. So there you go. So gamma correct node for the color, but I don't need to gamma correct the bump or the spec color. And then 0.454, bump at 0.05, file texture 0.1 on my bark. I've mapped the diffuse, roughness 0.1, reflectivity up, glossiness down, ambient occlusion on, and BRDF lowered. I don't really change any of the other things for tree bark. So that's a quick tree bark setup. And this is already assigned to all of my objects. So if I go and right click and say select objects with material, it selects all of the tree bark. So what would be the next issue? Well, obviously this texture needs to be repeated. And because if I want to preview that out here and I hit 6 and give it a second, you'll see that it's going to preview, but it's not going to look great. And so you can see it's going to look all blurry. And that's just because of the MIA material and the fact that there's a gamma node in there. So what I like to do is create another shader, just a regular Maya blend, and map my file texture into its color. And then everything that's assigned the MIA material I will select, and I will assign this blend. And what that means is I can use the blend for previewing in hardware. So I can see how this is working from a repeat perspective. And you can see that for these trees, I'm going to have different repeat values for different objects. So if I now go to my placement node and double click on it, you can see like for this trunk here, if I put the repeats in V to 2 or to 10, you can see that we're going to start getting closer to what we might need for this trunk. Although a repeat of 10 in V, and obviously I could also repeat this twice in U if I wanted it to be even tighter. And again, you need to use tileable textures for bark. So while that works for this one, if I scroll around, you can see it works okay for these tree trunks, but it doesn't work very well for this trunk right here. So you're going to end up having different shaders with different file textures. Or different file texture repeat settings. So basically what it means is that for a lot of the tree branches, a repeat of 10 or 8, let's say, is working okay. It's just there are going to be some objects in here, like this one right there, where that's not going to work right. But since we're going to be doing these test renders, you know, from a distance, let's say from here, just for testing out our shader, then this is fine for now. So if I'm happy with those repeats, select objects with material with that blend and reassign the bark. So that's a useful way to swap what shaders assigned to lots of objects, is just select and then assign with the other one. So cool. So now we've got our scene set up with physical sun and physical sky. And we've got our trees, and we've got our tree bark shader blocked out, even though we need to change the repeats on a couple of the trunks. And then finally, going back to Hypershade, then we have our leaf shader, or leaves MIA, and that's the next thing that we want to block out. So for the leaf shader inside here, there's obviously a few things that need to be changed here as well. So if I go in and look again, you know, from the perspective of default things that need to be changed. First off, obviously I want to texture map a color. So I'm going to click on texture. I'm going to go to gamma, and I'm going to set my gamma to 0.454 and wait for this to wake up. So 0.454, 0.454, and 0.454. And also, Maya's acting a little slow right now, so it's probably a good idea for me to save my scene. Let me do that real quick. All right, save my scene. So on the gamma correct node, right now the value is black, but I'm going to want to end up putting a texture inside there. And so I'm going to go in and go to the texture button, and I'm going to click that, and then grab a file texture. And for some reason my computer is acting all slow right now. But all right, so I've got this file texture. I'm going to put the filter to 0.1, and again my scene is acting strangely slow. So I'm just going to close the scene and open it real quick. Sometimes that happens, and so I'll be right back. All right, I actually didn't close it and reopen. I just realized it was because I had texture display on in hardware. So I realized the moment that I paused, I'm like, oh, it's trying to update in hardware. So keep your shading just to regular flat shading. So on my file texture for my leaves, obviously I need a leaf texture. Now, all of these trees and all of their leaves have their UVs at the defaults right now, which means if I select any of the leaves and I go to the UV texture editor, we can see that the UVs for the leaves are all in 0 to 1, as I've mentioned. And they're all going to be displayed as black right now just because there's no texture associated with it. So if I want to texture map these trees with some leaves, obviously I need a leaf that has a color map with an alpha channel. So I'm going to just jump to Photoshop real quick. All right. And in Photoshop, I've just navigated to a directory where I have, a bunch of different leaf scans that I've done and things that I've grabbed online or CG textures or whatnot. And so with a leaf, obviously you want something where you have a front and a back. So if I go into CG textures and I go, let's say, to birch, I was able to find, for example, CG textures, just this leaf that had a front and a back, but it didn't have them lined up with each other, and it didn't have all the other maps like a transparency map and a spec map or a bump map or whatever. And so those you have to create yourself. So, but if I open just the front map and take a look at it, you'll see that it's a square texture. It has this leaf in it, and then it has an alpha channel, which is obviously used for transparency, although with the MIA material, you're mapping it to the cutout opacity. So let's say we want to use this leaf. That's fine. This is going to give every single leaf in my tree exactly the same texture. Alternately, it's nice to have textures that look like this, where you actually have a 3 by 3 or 2 by 2 or 4 by 4 grid of textures. So if I look at this, you can see I have 9 different maple leaves and I have this alpha channel. And so this is obviously great from the perspective of being able to create variety in the leaves in your trees. And so when you want to create something like this, though, that means that the UVs of your leaves need to be arranged into a 2 by 2, 3 by 3, 4 by 4 tile structure. And that's something that I do via a script that you can get at the DJX blog. And it's really, really useful. And so what I'm going to do is on my trees is I like to, whenever I import an Onyx tree, is I run that script on the leaves for all of my trees. So that gives me the flexibility of doing 3 by 3. I can still just put the same leaf texture on all of them because I can set the repeats on a single leaf texture to 3 by 3 on the Place 2D node and it'll work. So how do I get the UVs to be set up that way? Well, you'll see I have a little script here, or a button on my shelf that says import DJPFX UVs. And so that script is something that's free. You can download it. Let me just show you real quick where. So you can see now I'm at the DJX blog, and there's a post called Maya PaintFX Leaf UV Layout Script. But this works for not just PaintFX trees, but Onyx trees as well. And so you can see it takes something that looks like this and turns it into this, which is great. So you should go to the download page, download the script, it's free, install it, follow directions on how to install it, and then all you type in Maya is this once it's installed. And then inside there you put whether you want 3 by 3, 2 by 2, or 4 by 4. So really, really cool. So in Maya, I can go and select the leaves for one of my trees, go to the script editor. I can just drag this text in here to import that script and set it into a 3 by 3 layout. And if I hit enter, it'll then start to calculate. So this tree has 220,000 polys for the leaves. So this script will probably end up taking a good, 10 or 15 seconds to calculate. So it doesn't really take that long, but it is something that per tree I'm going to have to do this. So let's just give this a second to calculate. All right, so that finished. You can see I got information inside here. 27,000 shells were generated. So if I now select this and go to the UV texture editor, you'll see it's now in a 3x3. So it just allows you to get random textures on all the leaves. So it's, or at least 9 different random textures. So I'd want to do that for all of the trees inside here. That would kind of be my next step. So if I select this one also has a lot of polys on it, but doesn't matter. Just drag this in here and hit enter, and then wait a few seconds for it to calculate. All right, so now that calculated, select the leaves, UV texture editor, and now that's in 3x3. So I'm going to need to do this for all of these trees, and I already have a scene where I've done that, so let's just go and switch to that scene real quick. All right, so I've now switched to a scene where you can see I've named all of these group nodes. I've also, on all of these, you can see if I select the leaves and go to the UV texture editor, we can see that they're all in 3x3. And then now, if we go to Hypershade, so I've got my 3 shaders, the bark, this one is the ground, and then the leaves. So back to the leaf shader. So for the leaf shader, first thing I want to do is map the color. So I can choose something that's 3x3 now that my UVs are laid out that way. If we just jump back to Photoshop, meaning something like this, and if I go in here, you'll see for something like this that I have a front color. You'll see that when I can have a back color, I do, meaning a back color that's actually a scan of the back of the leaf. So in this one, I was only able to find these leaves, but not all of them really had a front and a back, but some of them did. And so if we look inside here, you can see if I grab front color and back color, you can see actually for this one I did have backs. So you can see you have to take the time to align them and get everything to work out pretty well. And then for the alpha, for the color, you can see I kind of extend the edge out and blur it a little bit, which just gives you less of a chance of getting a fringe on the outline. And so front color and back color, you'll see in here I have bump, I have speck, and so you'll see I have a front speck and a back speck because I use two-sided shaders very often, so the front speck is a lot brighter than the back speck. So here we can see a speck map, which is just adjusting levels. You can see I have a transparency map, which just allows the veins just to be a little bit more opaque, a little less translucent. So all of these maps are good to have. So all of this is talked about in detail in the other DVDs as far as how to make them and what to do in Photoshop, but you got to have them. And but let's say we just for now just deal with something that's just a single leaf. So let's say we go in and we use this one. So I have a front color and a back color and front translucency or SSS, but it's really just translucency, speck, bump, all that stuff. So let's say we're going to use this one. Even though this is just a single leaf, what I'll point out is that if I now go to color and I map it with the gamma correct node, 0.454, and then I'm going to go and map that with a file texture and immediately put the filter to 0.1. And then I'm going to go and grab that texture. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to grab the front color. So now I've got this. But since my UVs have been laid out into a 3x3, if I just for now want to just use this texture, I can go to the placement node and set it to 3x3. And this is going to work. So that's just a useful thing that if you have a tree and you want to just use one texture, but it's 3x3, you can still do it. And then the cool thing is if I wanted to add variety into this, I still can, because I could go to color balance and texture map something like a fractal or a noise pattern or all sorts of things, to the color gain or color offset to randomize the color of these 9 leaves, even though it's starting from a single texture. But for now, we have this color map, but what are some things I want to change? Well, first of all, for leaves, the reflectivity I'll put all the way up to 1, and I'll lower the glossiness down so that I get a blurry reflection on the leaf. So now leaves are different. So I often will start with 0.3, but anywhere from like 0.2 to 0.4 tends to be, works for most leaves. So if you have a really waxy, shiny leaf, you might use 0.4, 0.5. Usually I haven't gone up to 0.5 though. And if you have a leaf that's really fuzzy, then obviously the reflection on it's going to be a lot blurrier, and you might be as low as, 0.15 or 0.2. So I'm going to put it to 0.3 for now. Then very importantly, under advanced reflection, leaves have no thickness on my trees. And so therefore I want to make sure that it shows, even though it's single-sided, I want both sides of the card for the leaf to be reflective. So you have to turn this off. Skip reflection on inside. Very important. Then if I jump down to refraction, I want to use translucency. Translucency is done via refraction transparency, and it's related to this folder here called translucency. So if I turn on translucency, you want to put the weight value to 1 and then increase the transparency. So if the weight value for translucency is lower than 1, your leaves will be semi-transparent. And I want them to be completely opaque, but be translucent. So you have to set the weight value to 1, and then use the transparency to control how much translucency you're getting. So for leaves, I often start around 0.25. So anywhere from 0.15 to 0.4 tends to be the range, depending on how translucent the leaves are, which of course varies on the leaf. So, but this is my start point. Then on my leaves for the BRDF, which is, oh, and one more thing with the translucency. So refraction, translucency, very important. Since my leaves have no thickness, under advanced refraction, you need to set it to thin-walled as opposed to solid. So very important there. And then since I have my glossiness at 0.3, and my reflectivity at 1, I also want to use this BRDF curve. Leaves are very reflective at glancing angles, so I'm going to leave the 90-degree reflection at 1, and then the 0-degree reflection, where it's facing the camera, depends on the leaf and how reflective it is. So I use a range anywhere in there, usually for leaves between 0.1 and 0.3. And so for now, leaving it at 0.2 might be a little high, but maybe we'll just go to 0.15 as a start point. So translucency is on with a weight of 1. Refraction has transparency at 0.25, set to thin-walled. Reflectivity is at 1, glossiness is 0.3. Ambient occlusion, I want to turn that on for my leaves. And that's basically it, but now I need to do more stuff with textures. So the first thing is that, as we know, this texture has an alpha channel, which I want to use. But we're not going to map that to transparency. We're going to map it to something called cutout opacity. And the alpha channel that I have in here, white represents what I want to be opaque, but for cutout opacity it has the reverse as far as what it's expecting. And so as opposed to flipping my alpha channel, what I do is I create a utility node, which is called the reverse utility, and I can just output, go to other, and connect the out transparency, which is your alpha channel, to input. So that's just going to flip the alpha channel. But then this is a vector. It has RGB values, and cutout opacity expects a float, which just has a single grayscale value. So I have to take this and use a luminance node and just output that to value. And then I can connect the luminance node. I have to go to other, take the out value, and connect that to cutout opacity. And now my leaves will have the proper transparency. So this is really important. So now I have color mapped. It's mapped to diffuse. I've got my texture, and I've got my alpha channel. So what else do I need? So, well, my leaves have a front and a back. So I also want to have the back color in here. So if I go in and create another gamma utility and another file texture, and connect that to value and put the gamma to 0.454. And then in here I grab on my leaf the back color, and then on the back color make sure that I set the filter to 0.1. So then also this needs to be repeated 3 by 3. Instead of doing that on a whole bunch of placement nodes, I can delete this placement node and just share default the same placement node with multiple file textures. Really useful. So this is the front, this is the back. So how do I get that to work? I have to go to Mental Ray, Sample Compositing, MIB two-sided, break that connection that's going to the diffuse, and basically just say this is the front, this is the back, and that gets connected to diffuse. Really, really easy. So gamma correct nodes at 0.454, front texture, filter of 0.1, back texture, filter of 0.1, both sharing the same placement node. The color map has the alpha channel that's going into cutout opacity, and my two-sided node is going into diffuse. So now I have color for the front and color for the back of the leaf. So what else do I need? Well, I pointed out that I have a reflection map or a spec map, so I can go and map that in. So that I don't need a gamma correct node, so I can directly just go and grab my, let's say we grab front spec, and then again delete its placement node and share the same placement node. And on that also put the filter to 0.1. I also have a bump map, so I can go to bump, go to standard bump, file texture, go to 0.05 as a start point, and on the file texture, grab bump. So we could obviously have front bump, front spec, back spec, but often, unless you're going to be really, really close to your leaves, I do have a different texture for front and back color, but as far as front and back spec, I'm kind of lazy about that because you don't really notice that unless you're really doing a hero leaf that's really close to camera. When you're doing trees from a distance like we're doing right now, it's not really super noticeable. I mean, it is. It'll add a little bit of realism, especially the spec, so it's kind of up to you. But we're just kind of going quick right now. So, but now that you've seen how to use the MIB two-sided node, it should be very obvious to you how to get those mapped. So I've got bump. On my bump node 0.05, and then for the bump map, as far as the filter goes, often for my bump maps I put the filter to 0.5 as opposed to 0.1, so it adds a little bit of a blur to the bump. So if the trees are in the mid to background, that's a good idea. So if the bump is really, really sharp, it's another thing that can create some sizzling in an animation. And so for mid to background trees, it's okay to add a little bit of a filter to it. I've found it looks better. What else? I have my transparency map, so that would go under refraction. That's the one that has the veins of the leaf in it. That gets mapped to your refraction color. By default, we have this at white, but that texture that I have in here is basically white. It just has a little bit of black where the veins are. And for that one, my filter would go to 0.1. Okay, and then of course, share the same placement node. All right, so now I have my spec map, my transparency map, my front color, my back color, my alpha channel, which is going into cutout opacity, my bump map, which has a very low bump depth, and those are pretty much it, except for one last thing that I need to map, which is my translucency color. So for the translucency color, what you want to do is you want to take the color that the leaf should be when it's backlit, which can be different from the front versus the back, but they're going to be kind of similar. And often if you have a leaf like this, where you have, for example, a dark front and a bright back, then the translucency color is going to be closer to the back color. Meaning that, when lit from behind, both colors are kind of averaged to create the translucent effect. So it's not going to be, when you look at a leaf like this, and see it illuminated, it's not going to get darker. It's actually going to get maintain this value, or something dark would go to this value. So often for translucency color, the translucency that you're using is a version of the color map that's a little brighter and a little bit more saturated. And it depends on the leaf. So in this case, I could really get away with just using my back color map as my translucency color if I wanted to. If I go in here and I want to map this, the way you need to do it though is you need to have your translucency map going through a gamma correct node and then into a multiply divide node. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to go to translucency color, utilities, multiply divide, and since my transparency is set to 0.25, I need to put on the multiply divide node a number that multiplies this to get to a value of 1. So 0.25 times 4 is 1. So this is going to be 4. And then I will, in here, put my gamma correct utility, because this is a color map. And then here will go my file texture, which I will put to 0.1. So let's go and graph this. Let's get rid of that placement node. Share the same placement node. So you can see file texture, grab color. So you can see I have my front SSS. So I have my front color, my back color. I could just use the back color if I wanted. You'll see my front SSS is almost similar to the back color, as I mentioned. So when backlit, it gets a little brighter. And filter 0.1. So my translucency map gets gamma corrected, 0.454. The output of that goes into a multiply divide utility. It's going into multiply input 1, multiplying by a value of 4, because my transparency is set to 0.25. And that's a leaf shader. So I went through it kind of quick because this is kind of a review, but that's kind of everything you need to know. So my diffuse is mapped, my reflection is at 1, glossiness at 0.3, skip reflection on inside is off, refraction, I've mapped the color with my veins, transparency is at 0.25, set to thin walled, BRDF, low reflection as it's facing the camera, very high reflection as it turns away. Translucency on with a weight of 1 and my map. Ambient occlusion on. Standard bump map. And a cutout opacity map for the transparency. And that gives you a leaf shader. So with this shader, it's very easy now for me to swap these textures. And if I do use or switch to a 3x3, then all I need to do on my placement node is change the repeats from 3 to 3 to 1 to 1 if I actually have a 3x3 texture. So let me save. So if I also now go out here, you'll see all the leaves are still black. That's just an MIA material thing. It doesn't know which texture to display in hardware. So what you can do is just select one of your leaves, go to the UV texture editor, and go to textures and just grab one of the textures that's associated with the shader. And once you do that, everything assigned that shader will shade to a normal value again instead of black. So save. And now with all of our setup, we can do a quick render and see what it looks like. So we've got our sun inside here. So let me just go, there's some keys on it in this scene. Let's delete those. Let's just go and zero out some of that stuff. So we have a sunlight. And we can maybe make it come a relatively high angle inside there. So if it's a very high angle sun like noon or midday, that's when your f-stop would probably need to be around 9. But if I lower it so that it's on the horizon, then my f-stop might need to get lower so the aperture gets bigger and it lets in more light. But let's start, and I'll do a couple renders that we can take a look at. So, but I've got that set up. Save. Render view. That's a render from earlier that we looked at. And now let's just go in and do another render. Render persp. All right, so I did 2 renders. You can see they only took 1:24 each, so it rendered pretty quick. So front sun and rear sun. and it looks good. So you can see we're getting the nice speck. We can see, different values in leaves for front and rear color. We can see when backlit, we're getting the translucency along the edges, and we can see the reflectivity inside here as it's facing the camera, not too high. So it's a good start point for a leaf shader. So basically, the next thing that I would do is for all these different kinds of trees is assign the appropriate kind of leaf textures, whether it's a maple tree or a birch tree or an oak tree or an avocado tree, or there's so many different kinds of textures that I've sort of amassed while working on this kind of stuff that I can go and assign. And so, but for simplicity's sake, I obviously don't want to have to necessarily rebuild this shading network all the time. And so once you have the shading network built, it's very easy to just duplicate it and swap the leaf textures. So meaning if I select this, and let's say I now call this birch leaf, MIA. And now I'll select it and go to Edit, Duplicate Shading Network. So now I get a copy, and this one, let's say we'll call it maple leaf, MIA. So, well, for maple, I know that I have a texture that is 3 by 3. And so I would go to my placement node and set it to 1 by 1. And then just go in here and just start swapping the texture. So if I go to Emaps, Leaves, Maple. So maple front color, which has the alpha channel. This is my transparency map, maple transparency. This is my translucency, so front SSS. This is my speck, so front speck. This is my bump, so front bump. And this is my translucency. Actually, this was supposed to be my back color, so back color. This down here is my translucency, so front SSS. Cool. So that's my speck, that's my back color, that's my front color, that's my bump, and that's my front SSS. And so now I have a maple leaf shader. So obviously, if I was going to make any changes, then it would be a matter of like, well, are maple leaves more or less reflective? Are they more or less glossy? And so forth, to make some quick changes. And then I can go in here and decide, well, let's go and assign, I don't have in here anything that's specifically a maple tree, but we'll just go and assign that to a couple of the trees inside here, just so we have some variety. And then let's go and make another one. So I'll grab that, edit, duplicate shading network, graph. And then this one, maybe we'll call this oak leaf, MIA. And then go to color. And then if I go in here, I have oak. So I have oak autumn, which is this. I have oak spiky, which is this. And I have oak green, which just has the green texture because it's based on this one, so I can reuse the same bump and spec maps. So if we try and do oak green, I have my front color and my back color and my translucency, and then my bump, which I grab from here, and my speck, and my transparency, and that should be it. So oak speck, oak back color, oak front color, oak bump, and oak translucency. So that's that guy. So we can go to a couple of these and assign this one. And then let's do one more. So grab grab that shader, duplicate shading network, graph. This one, let's say we'll call avocado leaf MIA. And then go up here. Avocado, this is something that I scanned. So I've got front color, back color, spec, I don't think I did a transparency map for this one. I did not. So I'm going to not use transparency in here. But on this guy, since I deleted that, I have to go to refraction and make sure I set that to white. All right, my translucency, avocado front SSS, avocado bump. All right, so front SSS, bump, front color, back color, and avocado spec. So all of these say avocado, avocado, avocado. I have a big avocado tree in my backyard, so I just grabbed a bunch of leaves and scanned them. So if we jump to Photoshop, just so you can see what that looks like, avocado trees have really cool leaves. So we can see inside here, if I grab the front color and the back color, what we have. So if I zoom in, you can see what this map looks like. So front, back, and also alpha. They've got some holes and stuff in them. Alrighty. And then since I created that, I should assign that to something. So avocado leaf, and let's go and grab a couple trees in here. And let's say maybe that one. Okay, so now all of these are mapped to something. So if I go in here and say select objects with material, select objects with material, select objects with material, select objects with material. So I've created a few different leaf shaders. They all have the same settings for reflectivity right now, just because that would be another thing to tweak. And then for the ones that are displaying, as black, remember you can just select it, UV text editor, grab a texture. So this one's black. And that one's black. All right, cool. Save my scene. And let's do a couple more renders. So render. And let that go for a sec. And it'll start to tile in, and I'm just going to pause and we'll look at a couple more renders. And final gather tiles starting to appear. All right, so I rendered 3 different stills. And so we can see from before where we have the same leaf texture on everything, which is just one leaf that's being repeated 3 times. So once we look at this, we can clearly start to see we get some breakup and we get some variety. We can see the benefit of the 3x3 tile thing. So now we can see different colors in the leaves. So just change the sun direction, just looks a little cooler. And then I did another render where we're a little closer, so it's a little bit more apparent. So we can see up here are the avocado leaves. So we can see we get some yellow ones in there and some different shapes. These are the maple leaves and the oak leaves. Some of these trees, based on trying to do something like a maple or an oak, should be sky sensitive, and they're not on the trees. So I'm just randomly applying leaf textures to these trees. But you'll probably find yourself doing that a lot too. It's if you're going for true realism, obviously you want to make a maple tree in Onyx and apply maple leaves to it. But from a creative perspective, when you're populating a more like a fantasy scene or a scene that you're making up, it becomes a little bit less important to be anal to reality. It's just a matter of trying to break things up and have a little bit of variety. But you can see that all these renders look pretty decent, given that um, it's just a matter of like once you've done this a lot of times, you know exactly how to set your settings. So my final gather settings, my physical sun and sky and exposure node and all the shaders on my settings, right off the bat, it looks pretty decent just because I've done this a million times. But it should be the same for you too. Just sort of copy my workflow, and that gives you a great start point. But again, it's just a start point. For more realism, I would, it'd be wise to go in and obviously tweak the shader settings so that some of these have a different spec map for the front and the back with the MIB two-sided, and adjusting the translucency and the reflectivity so that it's appropriate to the type of leaf that you're creating, and that creates a little more variety, because obviously right now all of these have the exact same reflectivity settings, which is going to unify the look, but it's nice to create organic variety when you're doing nature type renders. Also, obviously, in here with the maple shader, since the value of the front color and back color and translucency map is so much brighter, we get a lot stronger translucency. So, which does make sense because it's a lighter value leaf. And so you could obviously go and dial that down by taking the translucency attribute, which is right now at 0.25, and lowering it to 0.2 or 0.15 if you felt it's too translucent. But hopefully you get the idea. So that's our quick review on rendering trees. So with physical sun and sky and MIA materials. So it was I went through a lot of stuff in this hour, but this chapter should be useful for you if you haven't seen the other DVDs, and if you have, it's just hopefully a useful refresher. So now that we've talked about and reviewed rendering, we can now get back to analyzing the Onyx library, and we'll move on to a more complete scene with broadleaf trees. So let's move on to that.